I'm Chris Walker, Executive Director of the International Forum for Democratic Studies, and welcome to another installment of Democracy Ideas. I'm delighted to be joined today by Peter Pomerantsev. Peter, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, my pleasure.
And we're here to talk today about how, in the modern information age, Russia has managed to maintain meaningful control over news and information. Why don't we start with the domestic scene in Russia? Here we are in the era of globalization. The internet has proliferated around the world, and yet when it comes to news about information and politics, it seems as though the system has managed to keep a hold on the news and information that counts. How do you see that?
Well, firstly, there's a system of control which is very centralized. So the first thing that Putin did when he comes to power in 2000 is seize control over TV. He gets rid of the oligarchs who controlled it and puts it into the hands of friends or into the hands of the state. So there's also like a very simple physical centralized process where the heads of the TV channels meet in the Kremlin once a week. They're told who's allowed on TV, who's not, what the agenda is, what the framing should be, what the narratives are. So it's all scripted like a movie in that sense. So it's very, very, very centralized. So there's that kind of, that's really quite old school sort of, top-down instruction. What's innovative is that they play with narratives and ideology in a much more sophisticated way. So, for example, if communist news was a joke and they just lie about what was going on in the country, and there was a flat monotone giving you the communist ideology that no one believed in, the approach now is far more subtle. Firstly, they do show bad news. They just sort of frame it in a certain way. So the news will, will have. It'll always start with something about Putin, because Putin's at the top of the social pyramid. Then something bad happening in Russia. But right after that, something much worse happening in Ukraine. So they do try to include people's reality. They try to kind of soak it in. They've learned it's best that they leak the bad news first. They don't want another Chernobyl. But the main thing they've done is sort of create a sort of almost a simulacra of debate and discussion. So you'll have a pseudo left-wing opposition party rowing with a pseudo right-wing opposition party in sort of current affairs debating shows. The idea is to make Putin look good by contrast. They've just got much more sophisticated and supple and much more liquid in their approach to ideology.
So you've described the domestic scene and the innovations that have emerged in the recent years. At the same time, the Russian authorities have seen fit to take their media beyond Russia's borders. And certainly since the annexation of Crimea, people outside of Russia have come to pay more attention to this. What do you think are the most important features of Russia's international media, and what are its aims?
Well, primarily it's seen as a weapon. It's not seen as sort of classic PR or propaganda in the sense of sort of persuasion or public diplomacy or making your case. It's seen as a weapon, part of an arsenal, part of the arsenal of foreign policy with which to divide and conquer, sow confusion, subvert. So it's a very different approach to media. I mean, their news channels might look like news channels. They even borrow some of the opening credits from a Western show, but their purpose is very different. And the heads of Russian TV channels talk about themselves as actors in an information war and a psychological war. So that already is very, very different to our understanding of media. I think I divide it into two things. One is the action they have on Russian speakers in the near abroad, which is a very, very intense one. So, for example, a poll, this was back in 2006, in Estonia, showed that half of the Russian speakers in Estonia, and that's a fairly large amount of the population, sort of reject the idea that Estonia was ever colonized by the Soviet Union. I mean, they live in a separate reality. And once they live in that separate reality, they can be sort of pushed towards, theoretically maybe instigating some sort of revolt or just, stirring trouble for the Estonian central government. So that's one part, and that's a very kind of intense area of concern. Something else the Kremlin is trying to do is sort of reach out even beyond that by setting up international news agencies like Sputnik or Russia Today, which broadcasts in English, Spanish, German, Arabic, and expanding. There their aim is very different. There they try to see what's happening in, let's say, the West anyway, and kind of ride that wave. So if there's a bit of anti-EU sentiment in Europe, they'll try to fan that as much as they can because they want a weak EU. They certainly don't try to impose anything about Putin or love of Russia or loyalty to Russian imperialism like they would in Russian language. They just try to sort of muddy the waters, spread conspiracies, divide alliances, and so on and so forth.
And so you've described how Russia's international media has proliferated beyond the borders. And this, in some ways, tests some of the fundamental assumptions that many people had at the end of the Cold War, which was encouraging integration and interdependence would lead to the liberalization of politics in Russia, presumably also the news media. But somehow this integration has curdled in a way. What do we take from this now that we're in 2015?
Well, it hasn't just curdled. I mean, it has been a natural process. So ever since sort of the end of the Cold War, Russian military top brass have been looking for an asymmetric approach to getting back at the West. They could never compete with NATO militarily, so they needed to find, and here I'm trying to remember a quote from Marshal Sergeyev, who's a defense minister, revolutionary paths and asymmetric directions. And basically they worked out that the openness of the Western system, that which had made it more efficient than the Russian one, than the Soviet one, was actually a weakness. That the fact there were open markets meant that you could, send economic actors in who could sort of, mess with other people's economies. Most obviously sort of Russia's control of the energy system in a lot of Europe. That the openness of media meant that you could sort of see disinformation very brazenly into these societies and stir trouble inside of them. Even something like NGOs and culture, you could open your church in, or compatriots NGOs in the Baltics and use them to stir discontent. So they've worked out that our openness is also our great Achilles heel. So the choice we face is, it's very sharp in the Baltics, where they talk about this a lot, and in Ukraine. Do we become less liberal? Do we start shutting off TV channels? Do we start throwing out compatriots NGOs? But then, have we kind of lost the point of our whole exercise? Or do we find our own asymmetric responses to this asymmetric challenge?
So you've described this very difficult environment where Russia and other countries with the capacity and the intentions to operate beyond their borders are essentially exploiting the open space, the democratic space. And this has been underway now for quite a few years. If you were to fast forward, say 5 or so years into the future, given the trajectory of the approach of the Russian authorities in the information space, what do you see as the main challenges we should be preparing for in the coming years?
Yeah, this is not just Russia. So China has something very similar called the three warfares, which is a mixture of media, legal, psychological, and economic war to secure control in South Asia. I mean, Chinese propaganda in the West is quite soft. It's sort of Confucian institutes, and it's a classic soft power exercise. But in Asia, it's very, very aggressive. So when they wanted to wrest control over a shoal, or sort of a bit of a coral reef or something near the Philippines, it was almost like what Russia does around Ukraine. I mean, they launched a sort of psychological attack on the Philippines by sort of putting that, a military flotilla by their shores. They did a media attack calling the sort of Filipinos deranged radicals for protecting their territory. There was a legal attack using sort of false maps, and so on and so forth. So I think a lot of states have worked out that this is actually the way forward for conflicts in the 21st century, sort of contactless war, endless information psychological operations, sort of psyops gone mad. So if we're in for a century of psyops gone mad, we're sort of entering sort of an era of disinformation rather than information. We thought 21st century would be the year of information, but it might well be the opposite. It's going to be a century of lies, subversion, psychological manipulation, where victories are going to be very hard to define. Because in an old-fashioned war, you kind of, you came in, you planted a flag, you annexed some territory. Crimea is very old school, But most of these battles aren't going to be like that at all. They're going to be very intangible. They're going to be fought in in battles of the will and economic sort of subversion. It's going to be very, very hard to understand who's winning and who's losing half the time. So it's going to be a very, very chaotic century, and we're going to have to build new institutions to deal with it.
Peter Pomerantsev, thank you for a fascinating discussion.